without pity. Once again, Elizabeth Vargas.
The shootings at Colorado's Columbine High School last year were a tragic reminder of something every high school student knows. There is often fierce tension between the in crowd, usually athletes and cheerleaders, and those kids who dare to be different. In the small city I'm about to take you to, the tensions finally exploded one night. Two high school groups known as the Jocks and the Punks clashed, and the death of one teenager and the sensational outcome of his killer's trial would divide the entire community.
Isolated by miles of empty prairie, Amarillo is a lone outpost on the Texas Panhandle, a place where the stark landscape stretches to the horizon and the cowboy life isn't forgotten. On many Friday nights in Amarillo, high school football reigns supreme. The game is worshipped and the players revered. But across town, there is a very different group of teens. They have rebelled against the football culture and created one of their own. They call themselves punks. They sport mohawks, tattoos, and body piercing. The worlds of the punks and the jocks would collide one cold December night, and in one horrible moment, one teenager would be dead, and the other changed forever. 17-year-old Dustin Camp played on the high school football team. By all accounts, he was the all-American kid with above-average grades. Brian Deneke was different. He was a high school dropout who had minor scuffles with the law. He wore a green mohawk and a spiked collar. His parents were initially mortified by his appearance, but they say underneath a strange garb and rebellious lifestyle, Brian was a good kid. Brian's brother, Jason, agrees.
And he was always smiling. He was always trying to make people laugh. If somebody was in a bad mood or upset, he'd be trying to cheer them up, just things like that.
But not everyone in conservative Amarillo could see past the leather and chains. Brian's father says Brian paid a price for being different.
Groups of kids, would jump him, beat him up. I mean, all his friends had a nickname for him. They'd call him, refer to him as a fist magnet.
Why was it so important to subject himself to that kind of physical abuse?
Stubbornness, independent spirit. He felt like he had a right.
I sat down with a group of Brian's friends, and I must admit their look was initially distracting. They told me stories of how the jocks taunted them in the halls of the high school and on the streets.
Fags and freaks is one of the biggest words that they know.
Every night I would have people try to start fights with me.
How many of you guys have been attacked physically? Raise your hand.
The punks say it was this kind of name-calling and taunting that led to a minor scuffle with the jocks one Saturday night at the IHOP restaurant, the punks' regular hangout. For the next 7 days, tension between the two groups escalated, and rumors spread at the high school. The jocks and the punks would have it out the following weekend. On the evening of December 12th, the IHOP parking lot was packed with teenagers. Among them was Dustin Camp in his 1983 Cadillac. In the back seat was Elise Thompson.
When we drove up, there were a lot of people standing around in the parking lot, and I didn't see any punks there.
Minutes later, Jason Deneke showed up with his brother Brian. And what happened next depends on which side you believe. Jason said the jocks picked a fight.
I just walked up to the door. Next thing we heard was basically we heard faggot and freak, which is their choice words, and turned around, and basically we were surrounded.
The punks numbered 5 boys and 4 girls. Eyewitnesses estimate the number of jocks at anywhere between 20 and 50.
When you guys went to IHOP that night, were you carrying any weapons?
I always carried pepper spray.
Was Brian carrying anything?
Well, he always carried a chain with a lock on the end.
So you weren't going to IHOP armed with weapons, spoiling for a fight. You normally carry chains and police batons and mace.
Have to.
Because?
We always get jumped.
Mark Kelly, the IHOP manager that night, heard commotion in the parking lot.
The punks were by the door. The jocks kind of had a half circle, somebody around them telling them, won't you guys come fight, come fight.
The arguments grew more heated, so Kelly ordered everyone off the parking lot. But it didn't end there. The jocks and the punks moved across the street. Dustin Camp, along with his friend Rob Mansfield and Elise Thompson, followed the crowd in Dustin's car.
All these guys go ahead and go across the street, and the next thing I know, Brian takes off, so I'm not going to let him go by himself.
911, what's your emergency? Yes, I'm at the IHOP in Western, and there's going to be a major fight across the street.
Within seconds, the fists began to fly. The Jocks and the Punks have very different accounts of what happened next. Jackie Balderas says she saw the Jocks go after Brian.
There's like 10, 15 people around him just kicking him and hitting him and beating him up, and he's just like in the fetal position on the ground.
But Elise Thompson remembers it was the Punks who were beating a football player.
We looked over, and he was down on the ground with about 4 or 5 guys around him, some of whom had weapons.
As the two sides fought, Dustin Camp weaved his car through the crowd, first swiping punker Chris Oles.
It just seemed like he was trying to drive towards people, basically just trying to hit people.
After he hit the first guy, Rob started yelling, "Let's go, let's get out of here." Dustin started to kind of make his way towards the exit.
But Dustin Camp did not leave the parking lot. Instead, he made a fateful decision. He spun his car around and drove straight for Brian Deneke.
And then the car hit him, and he came up on the hood and then rolled underneath. And, you know, I felt 2 bumps, and I was just praying that the bumps had been the median and not his body.
Jason Deneke began running toward his brother.
It was just a lot of blood. He was just coughing up blood.
After it happened, there was like, they all kind of like fell into line, like into the line, and like we're leaving. And they were cheering. Like I heard people were all, yeah, yeah, and someone actually yelled, yeehaw.
As Jason Deneke cradled his dying brother in his arms, Dustin Camp left the parking lot and drove away. He turned onto the interstate to head home, and Elise's stunned silence turned into dread.
I leaned up in between the 2 boys, and I said, "What if he's dead?" And, you know, no one said anything.
Did you think that Brian Deneke was dead?
I knew in my heart that he was.
Brian Deneke was dead, but it was how his killer would be treated afterward that would stun the dead boy's grieving family and capture headlines around the country. When we come back, would Amarillo turn out to be a town without pity? Would this teenager be asked to pay for what he did?
Right after he hit Brian, he said, "I'm a ninja in my caddy." I bet he liked that one.
Amarillo.
We return now to a small city in Texas where a dangerous divide has opened up between 2 teenage groups. Things heated up during a melee one night outside a local hangout, and a high school athlete named Dustin Camp made a deadly decision. Instead of leaving the area, he turned his car around. The last thing his rival Brian Deneke saw on this earth was Camp's Cadillac heading straight toward him.
911, what's your emergency? We need an ambulance. Okay, what happened? Somebody has been injured.
In an Amarillo parking lot, a teenager lay dead, the aftermath of a fight between the Jocks and the Punks. Brian Deneke's mother, Betty, was home decorating the Christmas tree when the telephone rang. Her son, Jason, told her to come to the shopping center.
And I says, "Where's Brian?" And then I saw the blanket and him laying on the ground. And then the police officer told me that he was gone.
Brian Deneke's skull and chest had been crushed by the 2-ton Cadillac, his collarbone torn from his shoulder.
What for you was the most difficult of those details to learn?
To find out and to realize and to know that somebody took a car and deliberately ran down your son.
Dustin Camp had gone home. He parked his car in his parents' driveway and went to bed. When the police showed up at 6 o'clock the next morning, they found damage to the hood of the Cadillac, blood splattered underneath, and an empty bottle of Crown Royal whiskey inside.
Dustin Camp was arrested and charged with murder. In his statement to police, Camp said it was an accident. "I saw a guy swinging a bat at one of my friends. I was just going to knock him down with my car. It was icy on the ground. My car slid, and I guess he slipped, and my car went over him."
No, it was not an accident.
Sergeant Rudy Montano, the chief investigator on the case, says Camp's statement contradicted eyewitness accounts.
There's just too many witnesses to say this was an accident. It was a deliberate act.
Prosecutor John Coyle thought he had an open and shut case proving Dustin Camp had intentionally murdered Brian Deneke. He told the jury that Dustin Camp had never turned the wheel to avoid hitting Brian, that he fled the scene and lied to police. But the prosecutor's most damning evidence was what Elise Thompson heard Dustin say that night.
Right after he hit Brian, he said something very offhand, like, "I'm a ninja in my caddy," or something.
"I'm a ninja in my caddy."
And he said, "I bet he liked that one."
I think they're the utterings of a 17-year-old in a grip of panic and fear.
Warren Clark is Dustin Camp's attorney. Dustin Camp and his parents refused to speak with us on camera.
In that statement to police the next morning, he said that I slipped on some ice. The car slipped on some ice, and Brian probably slipped on some ice, and made it sound like it was accidental. It was a lie.
Well, people lie in these situations all the time. I find it not to be unusual in my line of business that people will lie.
In court, Clark dismissed Dustin's lies and instead launched a bold counterattack, putting Brian Deneke and his lifestyle on trial. He called the punks goons and armed thugs. He said Brian had been drinking and was the aggressor that night.
On that night of December 12th, he was a mean drunk. And he was. And he was armed, and he was beating on people.
Clark showed the jury what Brian Deneke was wearing that night: combat boots, camouflaged pants, and chains, painting the picture of an aggressive youth.
Anybody that knew Brian knew that that wasn't true. They believed in defending themselves if they had to, but they didn't believe in going out and seeking fights, picking on people.
Dustin Camp's attorney said that you guys were a bunch of menacing thugs who were there to kill somebody that night. You went to that parking lot armed and poised to do damage. True or false?
False. We see who the killer is. That's Dustin Camp.
Clark argued Dustin Camp was not a killer, but a teen who acted bravely and returned to the scene to save the life of his friend, who he said Brian Deneke was beating. Clark said Camp was merely acting in what he called self-defense of a third person.
When you argue self-defense, you argue that the act was intentionally done, but that the murder is excusable because it was self-defense.
You said Dustin had to take immediate action, and he took it. And if he had to live it over again, he would do it again.
Yeah.
Did you really mean that?
Yeah, I did mean that.
But that statement of yours implies that if he had to do it all over again, he wouldn't slow down. He wouldn't hit the brakes.
He could have driven away and left his friends in the lurch, but he chose to come back. It was out of loyalty. It may have been misdirected loyalty, but it was out of loyalty to his friend.
Brian Deneke's friends remember it differently.
What was Brian doing at the moment that Dustin Camp hit him with the car?
Running.
Running?
He was running from the car.
He was running away from the car. He wasn't fighting somebody?
He was by himself.
Which of the two sides would the Amarillo jury believe? After hearing the evidence, jurors took just 3 hours to decide. They convicted Dustin Camp, not of murder, but of the lesser crime of manslaughter. And it was what these 12 jurors would do next that would shock the city. Camp's punishment for killing a punker would only be probation.
Dustin Camp has been sentenced to probation for the murder of your son. He won't spend a night in jail.
He didn't spend the night. I don't know if he was spent an hour in jail, period. It's a joke, a slap on the wrist. You're still out with your family, still get to sleep in your bed at night.
Do you think if the tables had been turned and it was Brian Deneke who ran down and killed Dustin that night, that Brian Deneke would have gone to prison?
I think with Mr. Deneke's past, it would have been a harder job of keeping him out of prison. Plus, let's face it, appearance means something.
Does it?
Yes, it means something in Amarillo, Texas, and it means something in New York City. Sometimes the conclusions we reach on appearance are improper and not justified. But in a murder case, they're pretty important.
Since the trial, many punks say the way they look is still an issue. Some say they continue to be harassed and are considering leaving Amarillo. As for Dustin Camp, he graduated last spring, and many punks say they remember the reaction of some of his fellow students as Camp received his diploma.
He walked up there just strutting on that stage, got his diploma, walked down the aisle, and people cheered for him. Half the high school is cheering for this miserable son of a bitch.
Brian Deneke's parents have never spoken to Dustin Camp. They continue to live their lives in quiet devastation. They have just spent their third Christmas without their son.
What would you like Dustin Camp to know about Brian or about the pain he has caused you?
I wonder if sometimes wonder if he even accepts the fact that he did take out a life, that he killed someone who could have potentially contributed a lot to society.
There is still plenty of soul-searching going on in Amarillo. A memorial service was held in December on the very spot where Brian was killed. And many residents hope that the teenagers here were paying attention to this tragic lesson.
Harsh words and unwise choices can lead to tragedy. We're all a little more alike than we like to think, you know, that you can't hate someone and you can't even fight someone just because they look differently than you.
There are those in Amarillo who firmly believe that both Dustin Camp and his victim, Brian Deneke, bear responsibility for what happened that night. But the Deneke family is convinced that prejudice against their son's punk lifestyle swayed the jury. They are now turning to the civil courts for justice. They have filed a wrongful death suit against Dustin.